Yeah, I'm Professor Luca Somigli, the chair of the department, as I think most, if not all of you, know. And my job here today is very simple, straightforward, and it's simply to thank you for coming, and also to welcome here among us Licia Canton, who is one of our inaugural Gojo research fellows in the at the Iacobucci Centre for Italian-Canadian Studies. There's another fellow, Angela Nardozzi, who will speak, I think, sometime in April. So you will hear, you'll have a chance to hear both of our fellows share their research. This is, as I said, this is a brand new initiative. We're very fortunate and very excited to be able to provide some, for now, virtual space and some funding for research in various aspects of Italian-Canadian studies. So, as I said, welcome everyone, and welcome to Licia. And now I will actually let Paolo Frasca, Professor Paolo Frasca, who is also a professor in the Department of Italian Studies, properly introduce Licia, because he knows her and her work a lot better than I do, and he will do a much better job. So thank you for coming, and Paolo, over to you.
Grazie Luca, grazie mille, buon pomeriggio. Hello everyone. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces, actually all of them. It's so nice to feel like I'm with friends today, right, Licia? That's really wonderful. Thank you for making it today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I am located at this time, Treaty 13 or Toronto Purchase land. In the Ontario province of Canada, and acknowledge the First Nations that have stewarded this land since time immemorial, recorded and unrecorded First Nations, such as the Petun First Nation, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the First Credit River. I think about Indigenous nations in this talk in particular because the regulation of sexuality and gender was a big part of colonization on these lands, and it is not disconnected from what we'll be talking about today. So thinking about what gender and sexuality mean for Indigenous nations, and often the definition or the label that's used is two-spirit, which is specific to Indigenous nations, is important to us as we embark on this work as settlers on this land and discuss our work on this land. And I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Licia Canton, who earned a PhD in literature at Université de Montréal and an MA at McGill University. She is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Accenti magazine, and her writing, fiction, essays, poetry has been anthologized in English, French, Chinese, Italian, and Venetian. She has authored 2 collections of short stories, The Pink House and Other Stories, and Almond Wine and Fertility, published in Italy as Vino alla mandorla e fertilità. Dr. Canton has published 11 books as co-editor, including 2 volumes on the internment of Italian Canadians during World War II. She is the editor of the groundbreaking volume Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, came out last year. She is the director of the 28-minute documentary film Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian-Canadian, also released last year. Dr. Canton is currently a Medio Gojo Research Fellow in Italian-Canadian Studies and co-director of the Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Project at the University of Toronto. And in the past, she's been visiting professor and writer in residence at the University of Calabria in 2019, and honorary fellow in translation at the University of Hull, UK from 2018-2021. Since 2010, she has directed an internship program at Accenti magazine, overseeing the work of students from Bishop's University. She mentors emerging writers through the Quebec Writers Federation and evaluates manuscripts for the Writers Union of Canada. Dr. Canton is currently president of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers, a position she also held from 2010 to 2014. In recognition of her work in Italian-Canadian literature, Dr. Canton received the Italy and the World Prize Premio Italia nel Mondo in 2018. And Licia is also a friend, so I have so much more to share about Licia's work. I do want to say that something that's not included in her bio is that she really is a community leader and has this power of bringing community together in really beautiful, generative, and creative ways. And I'm really thankful to be part of the community that Dr. Canton has brought together in the last couple of years, and to have worked alongside her in these past couple of years. And the floor is yours, Licia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paolo. It's a real pleasure to speak to you today from Jaujaguet, Montreal. First, I'd like to thank Professor Luca Somili for the invitation to share my latest work. And it's a great honor to be Emilio Goggio Research Fellow in Italian-Canadian Studies. My work on queer Italian-Canadian writers goes hand in hand with the priority work being done at the Frank Iacobucci Centre. The title of this presentation is No Need to Whisper, Queering Italian-Canadian Literature, One Project at a Time. And I want to thank Paolo, he's taking care of the slides. And I'll just mention slide 2. Italian-Canadian Studies is an interdisciplinary field that emerged in Canada in the 1980s, and its mandate includes research, teaching, and community-oriented work. This lecture presents 2 projects that have recently contributed to the expansion of Italian-Canadian studies and to the growth of Italian-Canadian literature. I'll give a description and the history of the Queer and Italian-Canadian project. That is the larger project. And I'd like to introduce the Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Research Project, the work currently being done at the Frank Iacobucci Centre. The first project includes a documentary, an anthology, and a number of public activities, some supported in part by the Frank Iacobucci Centre. The second project is an academic offshoot of the larger initiative, which began in 2019. The second project is co-directed with Paolo Frasca, and this project is funded through the Frank Iacobucci Centre. The 2 projects focus on voices that are missing from Italian-Canadian cultural and academic discourses. At this time, I think it's perhaps appropriate to mention that I am primarily a writer, editor, translator. My contributions to academia have been as an independent scholar and as a freelancer. I've worked in the field of Italian-Canadian studies for more than 20 years, and I have a long-standing collaboration with the Italian Studies Department and the Iacobucci Centre, where I have organized conferences and events, given lectures and public readings. And since 2007, I have contributed essays to Italian-Canadiana and edited a special issue of the journal. Before working on queer Italian-Canadian writers, my focus was on Canadian women writers of Italian origin. And that is because that's where the need was at the time that I started. And that was where I saw the gap in scholarship. A few years back, I had a conversation with the executive members of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers, namely past presidents Maria Cristina Seccia, Delia De Santis, and Dominic Beneventi. The conversation was about the fact that very little work was being done on queer Italian-Canadian writers. And so I proposed a video project which evolved considerably and eventually became the documentary Creative Spaces. I also want to say that I am an active member of the Italian-Canadian cultural community. I am also the parent of a child who identifies as non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. Therefore, I come to this project with the experience of a literary person and as someone who is constantly learning about the LGBTQ+ community. As some of you know, the queer experience is not easily discussed in Italian-Canadian circles, in Italian-Canadian families. There's still a kind of lingering taboo and a culture of silence. In the past, being openly queer could have been met with violence or ostracism from family. And still today, some members of the Italian-Canadian communities adhere to that culture of silence. And that contributes to the erasure of LGBTQ+ experiences. The Queer and Italian-Canadian project was initiated in response to that silence, to bring attention attention to the children and grandchildren of immigrants who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. Their voices are often unheard. Their creative work is rarely acknowledged by the community itself. While the beginning of Italian-Canadian literature can be traced to the 1970s, few scholars have published on queer Italian-Canadian writing. Our initiatives have helped bring attention to queer Italian-Canadian literary artists. Queer Italian-Canadian writing is a growing literary corpus. In fact, the Queer and Italian-Canadian Project has been instrumental in discovering and identifying the writings of queer Italian-Canadians. In his introduction to the anthology Here and Now, Dominic Beneventi notes that, quote, the invisibility of queer writers of Italian-Canadian origin may be explained to some degree by the lingering taboos around the subject matter. Some are still not comfortable writing such personal stories. He makes the point that demographics and patterns of migration are also a factor. Quote, since the majority of Italian Canadians can trace their roots back to the large wave of Italian immigration, the transitional generation would not be writing about these kinds of subjects. It is their children and their grandchildren, born and raised in Canada, who are writing their queer stories, and we start to see an identifiable body of queer writing emerge in the early 2000s, end of quote. In the past, queer writers did not always feel comfortable writing about their queer reality or creating fictional characters that reflect that reality. In some instances, the writers came out, so to speak, through their creative production. One such example is playwright and screenwriter Steve Galluccio. In the documentary Creative Spaces, Galluccio states that everyone knew that he was gay because of the play Mambo Italiano. His parents attended the French language premiere in the year 2000, and that's how they found out that their son was gay. Although Galluccio wrote the semi-autobiographical play Mambo Italiano in English, Michel Tremblay's French translation was produced first by Théâtre Jean Ducette in the year 2000, and the next year, 2001, Montreal Centre Theatre produced the English premiere. The movie Mambo Italiano, which appeared in 2003, was an international hit which sold in more than 53 countries. Slide 3, please. More than 20 years later, how much has really changed within the Italian immigrant community? Let's hear what author Anna Camilleri has to say.
Speaking, yeah, when I think about my art practice, certainly what underpins all of the work that I've created is a real desire, is informed by my desire for systemic changes. You know, whether that's work that I've created individually or collectively, you know, within kind of larger multi-year projects. And also I recognize that still today, you know, I have this experience of people saying to me, I'm also Italian and queer, you know, in this whispered kind of voice. And so I realized that, you know, despite the fact that I've been making art for 25 years and much has changed, there is still this, like, just the presence of me and others like me is significant to people who are Italian descended and queer, or Italian descended and trans, that there is something about, you know, the impossibility or the intelligibility of, you know, of these identities, you know, intersecting. So I guess I'm kind of coming at that question in a couple of different ways.
Thank you, Paolo. That discussion with contributors to the volume Here and Now was organized by the University of Calabria, the Department of Humanistic Studies, and Centi Magazine in June 2021. The event included Mirko Casagranda, Maria Cristina Seccia, and the authors Anna Camilleri, Frank Canino, Liana Cusmano, Christopher Di Ratto, and Matthew Fox. And that full event is available, as you see, on YouTube. Go to Centi Magazine if you're interested in hearing the whole discussion. So we just heard Anna Camilleri state that still today people come to her in a whisper to say, I'm also Italian and queer. Much has changed in the last 2 decades with respect to LGBTQ plus issues, especially in public discourse. However, the Italian Canadian community has at times lagged behind in public acceptance and valorization of their queer children and their cultural production. And for some, yes, being queer and being of Italian origin is irreconcilable. And the Queer and Italian-Canadian project seeks to remedy this. Slide 4, please. The making of the project has certainly been affected by the pandemic. For instance, we have not yet had an in-person film screening for the documentary Creative Spaces. But on the positive side, the project has grown during the COVID-19 pandemic, and largely because of it. The project began taking shape in early 2019. Its aim was to highlight the work of LGBTQ plus Italian Canadians in order to emphasize the importance of diversity, acceptance, and inclusion in our communities. As Dominic Beneventi writes in his introduction to the anthology, the initial steps of the work were first to find the hidden community of writers and give them the visibility they so deserved. For to our knowledge, there were only a handful of such writers in the public eye. Second, to shed light on the everyday lived realities of people growing up queer within the Italian immigrant community, a community that is so often silent on such questions. We also wanted to explore to what extent these writers and artists draw from their ethnic roots and their gender and sexual identities in their own creative process. End of quote. In early 2019, there weren't as many writers as we know of today who openly identified as members of both communities through their writing and or in interviews. We knew of Steve Galluccio, of course, Monica Meneghetti, Christopher Di Rado, Elena Basile, Liana Cusmano, Salvatore Antonio, Frank Canino, Anna Camilleri, and other Canadian contributors to the volume Curaggia, which was published in 1998, edited by Chatu Di Leo and Mikalev. As the project grew and more potential participants were identified and contacted, some of these hesitated to participate because they would clearly be identified as members of the LGBTQ plus community. And others hesitated because the project is closely linked to their Italian upbringing, and one can think of memories of rejection or mistreatment. The reluctance to be identified as either queer or Italian-Canadian confirms the importance of our project, which has helped to shed light on the suffering that has taken place in some Italian immigrant circles and families, and to create a space for conversation and healing. Over the last year, with the film and the volume, we have begun a much needed conversation. We have dealt with issues that are not often discussed in the community, and we have taken concrete steps in response to the culture of silence. Slide 5, please. The documentary features Montreal writers Christopher Di Rado, who is the author of The Family Way, which was published in 2021, Steve Galluccio of Mambo Italiano fame, whom I mentioned earlier, and Liana Cusmano, also known as By Curious George, spoken word artist and author of the novel Catch and Release. Slide 6, please. In the documentary, Galluccio, Di Rado, and Cusmano discuss the intersections between their lives and their creative work, touching on spatiality, private spaces versus public spaces, temporality, and affect. Dominic Beneventi, professor of English and comparative literature at Université de Sherbrooke, provides the historical and theoretical commentary in the documentary. And as I mentioned, he heads the Queer Studies in Quebec research group, and the film was funded by this research group as well as by the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers. As Beneventi writes, quote, "It was an eye-opening and touching experience, bringing together two worlds that so often seem at odds with each other. On one side, family traditions held together by immigrant memory, the Italian language and its various dialects, the rituals and celebrations of domestic life, reunions, food, and extended family. On the other side, chosen families based on networks of friendship and care, on community organizations, and yes, on nightlife," end quote. Slide 7, please. I was inspired to interview queer Italian-Canadian writers after having read Monica Meneghetti's Globe and Mail piece titled, "I'm Queer and Italian-Canadian, Coming Out Was Twice as Hard." The initial plan was to interview about 10 writers in different parts of Canada. Why a film instead of a book when my expertise is not film? A film would reach a wider audience, different generations, and multiple communities. Writers in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver had agreed to be interviewed. We began in Montreal, where I and the cinematographers live. Béatrice Langlois-Bethez and Justine Rivard were students in cinema at Université de Montréal when they worked on the documentary as cinematographers and editors. Working with students was one of the requirements for funding the documentary provided by the research group. With COVID restrictions and the deadline to complete the documentary, the team was obliged to produce a film that is different than the original intention. And the hope is always to interview other writers across Canada in the near future. And now, Paolo, if we can, we'd like to watch, or I'd like to show the 2-minute trailer.
So do I still do look relaxed? Is it okay? No, you're really relaxed. So my name is Christopher Dorado.
Liana Cusmano.
Licia, and I was born in Montreal, in Little Italy, actually.
The safest place that I have felt being queer in any way was while writing.
But I knew that growing up that I was a little afraid to kind of reveal this part of myself to the Italian side of my family.
Even my Italian friends are like, "You're never going to make it." My extended family, "You're never going to make it." It's not for it because it's not for us.
So many people will challenge you and ask you to justify yourself. Why are you here? Who are you? Prove to me that you're trans and that you deserve to occupy this public space.
In my 20s, I was hidden. I was in the closet from my family.
And I'm not going to show up at my grandmother's house and like gender myself correctly. It's awful every time.
You're not supposed to be gay. That's changed a lot.
I can remember being, as a kid, really being afraid about my future.
But I knew that I would never be able to constrain myself. So many of us were raised to live in a world that doesn't exist anymore.
You know, given enough time, you will find your tribe and you will find people who will love you for you.
I can tell like I'm part of something that's bigger than me, and I can help other people hopefully feel like they're part of something that's bigger than them.
I guess I did belong, but I just didn't know it.
I can see the love she will have for me, a love deeper than anything I've ever felt from a man. And that scares me, frightens me that I can do all of those things I do to men, press my body up against theirs in a variety of different ways. But no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get them to stay inside. I can't make them love me. And with my mother, there is no effort. It's just there, as constant and infinite as the universe.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want me to read it again, or that was fine?
That was brilliant.
Yeah, okay.
That's great.
Thank you, Paolo. Slide 9, please. Here and Now, the groundbreaking anthology of queer Italian-Canadian writing was initiated because we were unable to interview writers across Canada. We had to find another way to bring these voices together. To date, Here and Now is the most comprehensive volume of writing by queer Italian-Canadians. To be included in the book, a contributor did not have to write about being queer or of Italian origin, but they had to identify as belonging to both communities. The volume features nonfiction, poetry, scripts, fiction, graphic story, and interviews. The contributors are established and prize-winning authors, as well as emerging writers. For some, this is their first publication. Some authors have chosen to use pseudonyms. Some authors are coming out by contributing to this anthology. Slide 10, please. The creative contributions are preceded by a 3-part introduction by scholars Dominic Beneventi, Michela Baldo, and Paolo Frasca. In her essay, Michela Baldo focuses on the production of lesbian writers and makes the link with the volume Curaggia, Writing by Women of Italian Descent, which appeared more than 20 years before Here and Now. As Baldo states, the writings in Here and Now are filled with sadness, shame, and frustration, but also with tenderness, joy, and hope. Paolo Frasca describes the volume Here and Now as a celebration of the change and the diversity that our communities have cultivated in this new home. The diverse is what we are here and now, a community of first, second, third, fourth generation migrants who recognize each other as sharing similar histories while upholding one another, as this collection does, in our differences. The collection of creative works opens with Monica Meneghetti's personal essay titled Biting the Parmesan, and it is a revised version of her piece in the Globe and Mail mentioned earlier. Writings from poetry to screenplays by more than 35 different creators follow. Luis de Filippis, for instance, shares the script for their prize-winning film For Nonna Anna. Amber Dawn sets her poem titled Preliminal Rites in a Small Town in Abruzzo. Erica Lenti's Why I Won't Tell My Grandmother I'm Gay, and Anthony Portulese's Another Timeless Italian Tradition, both of these nonfiction texts, both deal with the refusal to come out to their grandmothers. Matthew Fox's short fiction titled Toronto 1937 depicts the gay and lesbian underground scene in the 1930s. Some of the contributors are well-known Canadian writers, but they may not be easily recognized as being of Italian heritage. Many of the contributors responded to a call for submissions that was publicized. Others came to the project by word of mouth. Slide 11, please. Here and Now is a milestone in Canadian literature. It also contributes to the growth of the Italian-Canadian literature as a corpus, and it fills a gap within the field of Italian-Canadian studies. The volume was partially funded by donations from individuals, too numerous to mention, but they are all included in the acknowledgements in the book, as well as institutions, including the Queer Studies in Quebec Research Group, the Frank Iacobucci Centre, the University of Calabria, the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers, the English Language Arts Network, the Mariano Elia Chair in Italian-Canadian Studies at York University, Longreach Books, and Acenti Magazine. Slide 12, please. I am extremely grateful for this support and also to the contributors who helped promote the volume leading up to the publication, and in particular to Christopher DiRato, who volunteered to create and manage this website, Queer and Italian-Canadian. The website houses everything that we've done so far. So you can go to the site queeritaliancanadian.com to see all of the events connected to the project and also to see some of the media coverage. Slide 13, please. This project holds personal value for me. I have a very strong connection to my cultural roots. Being Italian-Canadian for me means living fully in the present as a Montrealer, a Quebecer, a Canadian. I had hoped that my community by now would have been more embracing, less silent. This work is also in response to my disappointment in the early stages of the project. At the start, I thought that I could use my position within the Italian-Canadian literary community to bring some attention to writers whose experiences have sometimes gone unnoticed, at times purposely so. I was motivated by questions such as, what can we all do to be more inclusive? How can we encourage others to listen, to speak, to be informed? What concrete steps can we take? Ideally, this project will reach beyond creative and academic collectives, and it will encourage people in the community to start a conversation, to ask questions, to look for information, to find answers. Every person that is touched by this project can help to fill the silence that has been detrimental to the queer children of immigrants, so that the Italian-Canadian community and the LGBTQ plus community can be in conversation with one another. Ultimately, it is hoped that the Queer and Italian-Canadian project will help us to rethink belonging in Italian-Canadian communities from a gendered perspective, and to rethink belonging in queer communities by considering questions of ethnicity and tradition. Slide 14, please. The academic research project at the Frank Iacobucci Centre was born out of the first project. One of the first public events that we did in May 2020 was a panel at Librissimi organized by director Happy Testa. The panel included Elio Iannacci, Chris DiRato, Elena Basile, Dominic Beneventi, and myself. It was after that event that Paolo Frasca contacted me. Now, Paolo and I had met in person very briefly at the Italian Department Holiday Gathering in December 2019. And for those of you who remember those festive gatherings, that seems like ages ago. I can tell you that even though I live in Montreal, I always made a point of coming to Toronto for those gatherings. And in fact, every September, I would write to Professor Salvatore Bancheri to ask for the date. Do you have the date? So I could put it in my calendar. Well, the last one I went to was where I met Paolo Frasca. And that's the last one that I went to. That I don't think there were any afterwards. Our conversation about the Queer and Italian-Canadian project took place 8 months later. And that was while I was seeking texts for the anthology. And an ongoing collaboration was born, as well as a friendship. Our shared goal was to look for concrete ways to challenge normative conceptions of Italian-Canadian identity and to create safe, satisfying spaces for queer Italian-Canadians to connect and possibly to create together. Slide 15, please. As a result of these shared objectives, the Frank Iacobucci Centre and then director Nicholas Terpstra supported a number of efforts connected to the Queer and Italian-Canadian project. For instance, the Centre helped fund the volume Here and Now. It also funded the work of graduate student Rachel Grasso, who worked on the contributions to Anthology in the initial stages. And in this slide, you can see that the Arts and Sciences at the University of Toronto took notice of the project and talked about our work in an article published in July of 2021. Slide 16, please. The Iacobucci Centre supported the first, and in fact, the only public presentation of the documentary on March 3rd of last year, exactly 1 year ago. The Centre also supported the launch of the volume Here and Now in June 2021. I must also mention that the Centre hired me as a research advisor so that I could work with Paolo Frasca to identify an academic research project based on the volume Here and Now. And that work evolved into what is now known as the Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Research Project. Important funding was allocated to interview queer Italian-Canadian artists in order to understand their personal and professional experiences and to create pedagogical tools for students to learn about this important aspect of Italian-Canadian social and cultural life. Slide 17, please. The Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Research Project, also called the Interview Project, is currently underway, and therefore I can only introduce it at this time. The Iacobucci Centre, as you know, has a well-defined mandate to study the cultural and social life of the Italian-Canadian community. The mandate clearly highlights the interdisciplinary approach of the Centre and its aim to foster the activities of academics, artists, professionals, and community activists working on topics related to all aspects of culture, experience, and history of the Italian diaspora in North America. This mandate highlights the need for Italian-Canadian studies to be a scholarly space that is in active conversation with the Italian-Canadian community. Italian-Canadian studies is a field that values contributions from outside the university setting. And this is exactly what this project does. The Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Research Project both honors the well-established tradition of the field and confronts through queer perspectives, quote, the figure of the ideal Italian migrant and the field, and that the field has contributed to establishing. That is, those are Paolo Frasca's words. Slide 18. The research project challenges the conceptions of the Italian-Canadian community from the perspective of gender and sexuality. The project asks Italian-Canadian communities to continue looking inward, but in liminal spaces yet to be openly explored. It asks questions such as, what are the experiences of LGBTQ plus or queer Italian-Canadians? How have the traditional values of Italian-Canadian communities often led to the marginalization of its queer members? What are the contributions of queer Italian-Canadians to the cultural and social life of the Italian-Canadian community? Who are the most marginalized and unacknowledged in the queer community? Through this study, we demonstrate that one, queer Italian-Canadian creators contribute to the richness of Italian-Canadian culture, while two, they also constitute an important element of the pluralistic cultural and social landscape of Canada. Slide 19, please. With the interview project, we want to explore and analyze the cultural and creative phenomena that lie at the intersection of queer and Italian-Canadian identities and experiences. Through literary analysis using theories of migration and sexual and gender diversity, and through community-based qualitative research, structured interviews informed by queer interdisciplinary research methodologies, the project provides insights into the queer Italian-Canadian community with two main objects of focus. One, the artists' experiences at the intersection of their sexual, gender, and ethnic identities, and two, their creative work and its connection to their gender, sexual, and ethnic identities and experiences. Slide 20, please. Slide 20, please. Oh, sorry, this 20. My bad. The work is being done with the help of research assistants Ariana Maliocco, Heather Dow, and Sam Rosati Martin. We have collected about 10 interviews thus far. We aim to collect 5 more by the end of this academic year. The plan is to publish our first study by the end of 2022. We are also working on a digital platform which will be launched in the coming months. The digital platform will contain short video excerpts from the interviews and the artists' biographies. At this time, the project focuses on interviewing the authors included in the anthology Here and Now. And the hope is that this will become a long-term research project that is broader in geographical scope. Academically, the research project adds a vital layer to the study of the social and cultural life of Italian Canadians, thereby providing a more complete, accurate, and inclusive account of our community and of its contributions. From a cultural and public perspective, it both targets the reticence with which matters of sexual and gender diversity are more often than not discussed in Italian Canadian communities. And it reaffirms the importance of the humanities in building kinship and fostering inclusion. With this project, we wish to make clear that a generative juncture exists between queer and Italian-Canadian identities, and that this is most tangible in artistic production, with a focus on creative writing. Different gender and sexual identities are represented in our pool of interviewees: lesbian, bisexual, gay, trans, non-binary, women, men. Different migration experiences are also represented, from first to third generation migrants, from northern to southern regions of Italy, from Canadian urban and suburban contexts. Looking at these creators' experiences and their cultural production, we aim to document the ways in which queer and Italian-Canadian identities may be in tension with one another, but not mutually exclusive. Our project wishes to highlight that these intersecting identities can be productively and inclusively integrated. The main objective of the interview project is a comprehensive analysis of the current experiences of queer Italian-Canadian artists and of their creative work. Therefore, our work also includes collecting materials that contribute to conversations on this intersection of migrant and queer identities. These include media, newspapers, magazines, film, television, radio, and also includes social media content that deals directly with issues of sexual and gender diversity in Italian-Canadian communities. Examples of this include a set of anti-LGBTQ plus opinion pieces published in the Corriere Canadese and a documentary, Creative Spaces. And student researchers are currently working to locate additional materials. Slide 21, please. The interviews, which began in the summer of 2021, are conducted on Zoom. The interview process is centered around a questionnaire and is supported by carefully developed ethics and distress protocols, given the delicate nature of the discussions. The questionnaire includes 42 questions divided into sets that cover the following areas of inquiry: demographic information and family histories, ethno-linguistic vitality, hetero-homonormativity, gender performativity, marginalization, kinships, creative stimuli and praxis, public visibility and accountability, and hopes for the future, in particular with respect to generative intersections between queerness and Italian heritage. Student researchers have a key role in this project with respect to data collection and management, but also in improving its methodologies. Student researchers have used their expertise in interview-based research, data management, and technology and literary cultural studies in order to allow this project to overcome important obstacles and to be more mindful of the ways in which it extracts information from its subjects. Slide 22, please. We are especially thankful to Anna Camilleri, whose previous experience conducting qualitative research in the field of social justice education helped to ensure that the first interviews ran smoothly. She also helped to train undergraduate researchers. Student researchers have also contributed immensely to the sense of community that this project fosters, building important relationships with interviewees. And these networks are fertile ground for future community-oriented and scholarly collaborations. And finally, the researchers have shared with us that the project has made a positive impact on their personal and professional journeys. Anna Camilleri has described the experience as, quote, nothing short of transformational. Connecting with other queer Italian Canadians has profoundly impacted my sense of self. This project has allowed me to imagine a future in which my queerness and Italian cultural identity can exist in harmony. In reconciling and integrating these different identities, I know I am healing ancestral wounds. By documenting the stories of queer Italian Canadians, we assert that we exist, that we have always existed. This project is a reclamation and reimagination. It is an opportunity to take up space in a cultural community that has often encouraged us to keep our queerness to a whisper. Heather Zdao, who conducted interviews from July to December 2021, shared the following. That before working on this project, she had, quote, rarely conceptualized her Italianità and queerness in tandem, rather as separate aspects of her life. For Heather Zdao, this project has fostered, quote, a new sense of comunità and belonging in both queer and Italian-Canadian spheres. In conclusion, the Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Interview Project will contribute meaningfully to our understanding of the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion of queer Italian Canadians from the larger Italian Canadian community. By incorporating queer perspectives into the study and understanding of Italian Canadian experiences, we can provide a more complete and nuanced account of the life of our communities. Through the study of queer Italian Canadian experiences and of the cultural production that is often inspired by these intersecting identities, we honor the diverse realities of our communities. We foster spaces in which Italian Canadians are able to celebrate the diversity of their communities and challenge the violence or the silencing often faced by queer Italian Canadians. The research leading to the publication of the volume Here and Now and the documentary Creative Spaces was instrumental in identifying the works of queer Italian Canadian writers. This in turn has led to the Queer Italian Canadian Artists Research Project at the Iacobucci Centre. Drawing from each other, the two projects seek to produce new knowledge and create a platform where the intersection of queer and Italian Canadian identities can be explored safely, openly, and creatively. I'm really excited to see the work currently being done at the Iacobucci Centre, and I'm happy to contribute to the center's growth through these projects. Slide 23, please. There is still a lot of work to be done, and in the meantime, I leave you with an invitation to attend the symposium that we are currently organized and which will take place virtually from April 1st to the 3rd. And the symposium is Queering Contemporary Italian Cultures, Home and Beyond. And the last slide gives you the title of the article that Paolo Frasca and I have co-authored, which is forthcoming in Italian Studies in Southern Africa, Making Connections, Bridging Communities, New Directions in Italian Canadian Studies. And a special thank you to Professor Paolo Frasca for his help, well, just generally speaking over the last year, and in particular with this presentation. And Paolo, if I'm sure you have lots to add, please feel free to add to what I've said.
Thank you so much, Licia, for that interesting presentation and for taking us through the journey of this project. Really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be part of this project. And I would have some things to say, but we don't have a lot of time, so maybe I'll take some questions or comments. Those are most welcome. So if you'd like to jump in, Giovanna, did I steal your job? Are you the one who says we could take questions at this time?
No, not to worry, not to worry. It's perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, would love to hear from you.
I guess I'll just reiterate, once again, feel free to either verbally pass over your questions or to use the chat. We'll be happy to bring those questions to Licia.
Yes, I also want to say that perhaps, Paolo, you can add my email to or just write to accenti@accenti.ca or lcanton@accenti.ca if people want to continue the discussion, or if they have some comments that they don't get a chance to share here, or if they have any questions. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I can tell you that through the project, the first project, for instance, the documentary, the interviews are with the 3 writers, because we knew of those 3 writers when we first started. And now if we were to do a second documentary just on Montreal writers, there are 8 that are included in the Here and Now anthology.
I think at this time, I'm sure there's so much to digest after such a wonderful and thought-provoking Gojo lecture that this conversation can definitely continue. If the questions come out afterwards, we're more than happy to field them, whether they come via our email or to the speaker's email. But at this time, I will pass the final word to Professor Frasca for some final words, and as well to Professor Somili for the same.
Just a big thank you to everybody for being here today and listening to the story of our project and some of the directions we're headed in. It's been moving slowly but surely, and in many ways it is moving at the speed of relationships, which is really important. And what I want to highlight about the work that Licia, Dr. Canton, has brought to the Frank Iacobucci Centre is that it really is at the intersection of the different missions of the center, which is to welcome not only thinkers and academics, but also activists and artists. And in some way, this project really checks off all of those boxes. So we're really thankful that we can work on this in this under the aegis of the Frank Iacobucci Centre, because it really hits the nail on the head with respect to the center's mission. And Professor Somili, on to you.
Thank you, Paul, and especially thank you, Licia, for this very rich overview, not only of your project, but in many ways of almost the history, one might say, of this investigation into various aspects of queer identities in the Italian Canadian community and the complexities of that conjunction. So thank you very much. We'll of course look forward to your continued involvement with the center. I'm sure there will be other occasions for public events around your research and your publications. And at this point, I guess all I will do is just remind you of the next Gojo lecture, which is, well, I should mention actually there's another event tomorrow. It's not a Gojo lecture, but it is co-sponsored by the department. It's a talk by a scholar, an Italian scholar, who is going to talk about Italian and Indigenous connections. The title of the talk is Reshaping Italian-Canadian and Indigenous Connection Through Naming Practices. The speaker is Anna Camilleri, and you can find more information in the events page of the website, and it's tomorrow, I believe, at 12, if memory doesn't fail me, which it often does. And then next week, next Thursday, Marco Malvestio, who was one of our postdoctoral fellow, unfortunately, during the first year of the pandemic. So he's going to be back virtually to share some of his research with us. The title of his talk is Domestic Jungles and Murderous Megaflora Plant Horror in Italian Science Fiction and Film. So I look forward to seeing you at these and other future events. Again, thank you to Paolo, thank you to Licia especially, and please join me in thanking her for her presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.